So, one of the biggest concepts around the whole identity profile, which moves away from a single typing system, is to not only lean into the idea of what your most efficient number is going to be, your headquarters, your home base, the place that you go to sleep and you wake up every night and every morning. We know that's a part of who you are. But we also want to talk about what is the experience as a human being when you encounter a number that may be very low for you? And what is the difference in that relationship between somebody who expresses a number high or efficiently, or they express it low or inefficient? What does it look like for us to have conversations around what happens to you if somebody interferes with your highest number? And what happens if somebody introduces your lowest number? Does it trigger you in a similar way, or can it have a trigger? What does it look like to be really efficient and really strong and really effective in a high number, but then be struggling to introduce or to utilize that number if it's low for you? So long story short, this series is going to be about conversations in each of the numbers as it relates to when it's high for you, when it's low for you, how it impacts you if somebody interferes with that goal, or if somebody introduces that unfamiliar space. Thanks for joining. 7 energy is one of those numbers on the Enneagram that almost exclusively gets caricaturized. When you think of a 7, if you have a positive relationship with a 7, you're going to smile. You're going to think there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of connection in just the kinetic nature of what a 7 is, even in terms of the speed that I just talked, the body language, and the facial expressions. But if you have a negative experience with a 7, if you say, I just don't interact well with 7s, oftentimes, most of the people that I know that don't are talking about the way they feel in relationship to that kinetic energy, in terms of that feels too bright, too hot, too energetic, kind of like we see sometimes in 8 and 3, because 7, 8, and 3 are those assertive, strong, extroverted energy stances. So for the sake of this video, I want to redeem a little of the language that we have around the 7 energy, and also introduce not only the capacity, the motivation, and the gift, but also, why is it so hard for some of us to engage in 7? 7 is my 4th, 5th lowest number. It's kind of what I call a pivot point. For me, if I engage 7 in a healthy way, it can be really life-giving. But if I engage 7 energy in a way that doesn't feel safe, it can be really, really life-threatening and triggering. So it can go both ways. But let's talk about 7 in a more mature, more healthy way, rather than that reductive, caricaturized, distilled, and often weaponized way that we talk about 7s, as if they're just a bottle rocket or a kite, because it's not true. 7 energy has the natural human capacity for enthusiasm, for energy, for joy, for childlike faith and excitement. It is energized by what it means to be alive and to be vibrant. But it's also really important to understand one of the things that can be really confusing, and this again is not something we're going to unpack now, but it's important to plant the seed for. One of the things that's most confusing is when you encounter a self-preservation 7, or what I refer to as an introverted 7, because they are motivated by the capacity of not only being enthusiastic, but by seeking out enthusiasm through experiences. They want those experiences, and it's life-giving for them to have novel experiences, but it doesn't mean that they're extroverted. It doesn't mean that they're explosive in terms of their frenetic or kinetic energy. So like when we talk about a phobic versus counterphobic 6 not necessarily being the most healthy language, when we look at a 7, when you meet an introverted and a really healthy, strong, introverted 7 energy, it throws all of the caricaturized versions of what a 7 is completely out the window. So let's shift from the job title and the caricaturized version and move into the innate human capacity for enthusiasm or joy or vibrancy. The motivation of experiences, especially novel and nuanced experiences, avoiding the antonym of stagnant, bored, and stuck. And then why does that develop such a gift of inspiration? Because when you look at a healthy 7 energy, a healthy 7 energy not only literally, but metaphorically is inspiring. And to inspire is to breathe. To breathe is to take breath in, spirit and pneuma, life and breath being pneuma. The idea of breathing in deeply is actually bringing life in. So when you look at inspiration, to inspire another person, I want you to realize that is talking about having a life-giving encounter. The way that a 7 energy engages in the world is to say, does that bring me life? Does that bring breath, spirit, and pneuma into my experience as a human being? And I need to seek that out. But if it goes off the rails and it becomes excessive, this is where you actually literally see 7s hyperventilate. How many of you have met a strong, especially an extroverted 7 energy, and when they're talking, they're just starting to accelerate, and all of a sudden you're trying to have a conversation with them, and they're just, can you just take a deep breath? Because as you start to accelerate in that 7 energy, you actually start to hyperventilate. You're inspired so quickly that you start to inspire too quickly. This is actually the kinetic nature of a 7. But when you see an introverted 7, or you see what's known as a self-preservation 7, they're still having that kinetic experience internally, but they're not expressing it externally. A great example is to look at Alex Holland, the free climber. That is, you have to be so grounded and so controlled to be able to do free climbing, like to climb El Capitan. That is not something where you can just be spontaneous and all of a sudden get super excited. There's so much control. But you cannot tell me that somebody is up that high with the probability of dying and their heart rate and their adrenaline is not high. It has to be, because physiologically they're in a life-threatening situation and it is life-giving for them. So this is where you see 7s become the adventurer, they become the Epicurean, they become the skydiver, they become the base jumper. Because 7, 8, and 3, but especially 7 energy, is addicted to adrenaline. They need to feel their heart rate go up. They need to feel that cortisol and that adrenaline move through their system. Whereas other numbers like 4, 5, and 9 are allergic to adrenaline. They want it to be lower so that when their heart rate feels like they can manage it at a lower rate, it doesn't become excessive. But this is why excess becomes the norm for a 7, because to feel that in your body, kinetically coursing through in a physiological way, is life-giving, even though you might be doing something that's life-threatening. So it creates some of that confusion when we don't know what it looks like to move in a 7 space. So as you're high in 7, like we talked about with being high in 8, remember, especially if you're more of the extroverted side of that, you're the more kinetic external processor, your capacity to come into a room and to shine a light on things, to inspire people and to light the world up, profoundly powerful. But sometimes you can burn a little bright, you can come in a little hot, and you can overwhelm people in the space by being a little too much, because the sun can both bring life into a space, and you need that to even do things like photosynthesis, but the sun can also, when it's magnified, and when you put it into a point, it can burn things. So too much of a good thing can sometimes happen. So what does it look like for us to rein in our natural capacity and practice what doesn't feel like it is something that we naturally access, which is to slow down and practice stillness? So credit to Chris Hewart who mentions that in the Sacred Enneagram, but I don't think there's a better example of why stillness is so helpful sometimes, especially for the extroverted 7, because to sit still physically and kinetically will turn on the part of the brain that deals with boredom and stagnant nature, which is what a 7 is allergic to. And if you eliminate somebody's capacity to do something adventurous or new or to move into novel spaces, boredom for a 7 feels physically painful. And boredom is fast track to discomfort, fast track to pain, fast track to suffering. And then all of a sudden, you're moving out and you're moving on and you're moving into the next thing and you're eloping in your own experience as a human being. So as you think about what it looks like to elope and to move on and to be incapable or sometimes find it difficult, and you break a sweat by causing yourself or requiring yourself to sit still, ask, why is that? Why is it so hard for me to be present? Why is it so hard for me to reflect on my past? Why is it so easy for me to say, don't worry about it, we'll figure it out. Don't worry about it, I got a new idea. Let's move into the next big thing. Because for a 7 to be present or to reflect or to sit still is going to be uncomfortable. And if it's uncomfortable, your brain is going to assume that it's traumatic until someone else says otherwise. So if you're high in a 7, figuring out what it looks like to even lower your heart rate a bit and be present to your own body and consider what it looks like for other people to be engaged in a way that might not be as bright or as kinetic as you, you can still inspire people by giving them a more restrained and controlled version of your energy. Because at the end of the day, we want you to burn bright, but we don't want you to burn out, okay? If you're low in a 7 energy, and 7 is one of those things that can be triggered, because remember, if somebody introduces a 7 space, especially when we think stereotypically of 7 being frenetic and kinetic, what does it look like for you to get triggered when all of a sudden somebody steps into the space with excitability or enthusiasm, or somebody steps into the space and says, I need us to have something new, what's something novel? And then you end up with change fatigue because you're constantly going, but I just want things to be consistent and I want them to be fixed. Not the natural energy of a 7, because they're moving into new spaces and new experiences. So as you get triggered, remember, especially with 7 spaces, if you're low in that, your natural response, which is actually healthy initially, but not sustainable, is to be skeptical and to throw up an alarm bell and go, well, I don't know if that feels approachable. Because if 7 is low for you, you either have negative experiences around that description that I just gave, where that doesn't feel life-giving, that doesn't feel like something you want to actively pursue, or you don't know what it looks like to encounter a space where 7 energy is expressed in a healthy and rewarding way. And the main way that I say that for the sake of this video, there's a lot of different ways that we can translate this, but every single person that I've met that is low in a 7 energy either doesn't know how to, or was specifically encountering spaces growing up that celebrating themselves or celebrating their own accomplishments or celebration in and of itself is an awkward space. So what does it look like for you to celebrate yourself as a person, to celebrate the wins, to say, you know what, we don't have all the answers, don't worry about it, we will figure it out, to have a little bit of that nonchalance and a little bit of that carefree nature. The 7 is that carefree, childlike experience to go, it's going to work out. I have no idea how. It's going to work out, which creates an incredible visionary in a company that says, I've got an idea. But it also creates that space of going, man, I just want to throw a party because you exist. And oftentimes, if we're low in 7, we don't know what it's like for somebody to throw a party, or for us to celebrate ourselves, or for somebody to say, you are a valuable creation, and I love you just for the fact that you exist. That might sound strange. So if somebody steps into the space and starts to celebrate you, or somebody steps into the space and starts to be excited about something that you did, do you disqualify it? Or do you think, I'm skeptical about what it is that they're seeking out, or what it is that their ulterior motive is, because why are you celebrating me just for the fact that I exist? Because 7s have the natural capacity to celebrate something just for the fact that it exists. So something to think about. And lastly, as you consider a 7 space, it is, whether high or low, a place for us to practice really effective breathing, because the gift of a 7 is inspiration. So if you are strong in a 7, sometimes you can hyperventilate, or you can forget about controlling that breathing rate and being conscientious of what is life-giving in your own body, because you can run out of water for a couple of days, you can run out of food for a couple of weeks, you can run out of community and relationship for a couple of decades. But you cannot run out of breath for more than a few minutes before it causes real damage. So whether you're high in 7 or low in 7, practicing just a centering, honest, deep, connected, present, in the body breath can anchor your entire brain and resource your entire body to think about the next experience, find your own body, and then ask yourself, what is it that I'm feeling as I recognize and become aware that I am present in this moment? Which is something that all of us can do through one single deep breath as we practice that 7 energy and essence. Thanks so much.